everybody, and welcome back to the next thrilling installment of There's a Will. I'm Will, and this is my show. But I'm not alone today. Today I have two scintillating, fascinating, impenetrable, perhaps, guests. I have with me in the studio Guy Pinsen and your favorite newsreader from England, who happens to be in Poland, Nicholas Richardson, my long-lost cousin. And we'll be discussing something very exciting today, and we hope it's going to lead to fisticuffs. We hope there'll be some brutality, because we just want to, in the studio, ape what's going on in the world. Actually, we're looking forward to a very civilized discussion from Guy and Nicholas about Brexit and things related to it. Guy will be taking the position of for Brexit. I hope he doesn't mind me saying that, because you'll know soon enough. And Nicholas will be taking a more, shall we say, European-centric position. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see if they can change their minds as we go through this discussion today. Guy Pinsen, of course, is a noted businessman in the country, a former member of the British Foreign Office, and all-round man about the country, well-known figure. And Nicholas, of course, attorney, Chamber of Commerce of Britain and Poland. What are you, vice president over there?
Vice chairman.
Vice chairman over there. It's like a vice chairman, like Chairman Mao.
Yeah. It works
like
on
a chairman.
Works on
couldn't be a president.
Works on a similar basis.
Sounds a little left to me, but never mind.
It's pretty centrist, I think.
It is, okay.
Yep.
Anyway, it is about business, but
yes,
so are the Chinese. I don't want to pursue this too long.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Whether or not the Chamber of Commerce is leading left or right, we may not find out today. Nicholas also, of course, works at Poland Daily, where he is an esteemed newsreader and reporter, and also a presenter on some of our history segments, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Welcome to the studio.
Thank you, William.
It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me back.
My goodness, yes. Now, you're most welcome, Guy. It was a lot of fun the last time you were here, and Nicholas and I, of course, always have a good time. Always stimulating conversation with both of you, and I thank you for that.
Pleasure.
It's nice to hear that.
It is, yeah. You don't hear it very often.
Even though we do know each other, we don't walk around, you know, in the hallways and the corridors of power.
We don't.
Here in nerve central of the TV station.
We don't.
Going, hey, I really enjoy your company. We don't say that.
We don't say that because
we don't do that.
It would be hard to say that.
We don't do that at all. We never do that. It's a shame. Maybe we should be nicer to each other.
We should. Well, you should be nicer to me, certainly.
Mm. Hey, get the ears fixed? No problem.
That's fine. Thank you.
No, it's the Prince Charles look, and it's very.
It's very fashionable this year.
Very fashionable.
Prince Charles look this year. Yes.
Yeah, listen, everybody loves Prince Charles.
Yeah.
Except no, never mind. I won't go there. I'm not going to go there. Guy, welcome to the studio. I was just saying, listen. Shall I just give a little opening to the Brexit thing? Now, you know, I'm not, obviously, a British person.
Obviously.
But I could have got my passport. I just was too bone idle to do it at one time.
Okay.
I lived in the UK, as you both know, for quite a long time. Went to university there, St. Andrews, and the London School of Economics. So, while not a card-carrying member, I was once asked to join the Carlton Club, which might make me seem to lean, well,
In a Thatcher direction.
In a Thatcher direction. Yeah. It was a very good friend of mine who invited me to do that. And I should have done it. I didn't do it at the time, but there were reasons. But at any rate, the Brexit question seems to hinge on an age-old problem, or let's say conflict, sometimes a bigger conflict, sometimes a lesser conflict, over the centuries between British power and continental power as represented by either the Spanish, the French, or the Germans, most lately in the 20th century. So there's always been this conflict. Britain has its had its empire. they still have, you know, they used to say the sun never sets, right, on the
It
British
technically
Empire. It's
did.
still true.
No, it's not true.
Almost true.
When Hong Kong reverted to China,
Yeah.
for the first time, the sun technically does set for several hours of the day on the British Empire.
Yeah, it does set.
It does set now.
For a little while.
For a little while now,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. But at any rate,
It never sets on the Commonwealth.
It's not on the Commonwealth. It
Never sets on the Commonwealth, no.
There you are. So this is the point of saying that, is that British influence is still very strong. And not only that, where does the English language come from? The language which we're using now is, of course, a British invention.
It is,
Yeah.
with the help from some Latin, some other
Right.
bit of German,
Yeah,
other
some
things.
Scandinavian,
bit of
yes.
French, bit of Norman French, particularly.
Lots of French.
In the beginning, lots of French, as Guy would say.
Yeah.
Or I won't say Guy.
Guy de Pinsen, exactly, yes.
Guy.
Guy.
Well,
Guy.
1,000 years ago.
De Pinsen.
Guy de
Yes,
Pinsen,
1066 and all that.
Yeah, yes, correct. So this conflict has been going on for a long time. So it is very easy to see how there can be antediluvian feelings of the British that who actually invented, you know, with Magna Carta and so forth, the unwritten constitution, the idea of controlling the power of the executive or the monarchy. So it would seem at this point that this long tradition of Britain has somehow run up against the lack of representation through direct voting in the upper echelons of the EU. And that's that was kind of the starting point, was it not? Don't you think?
That is the fundamental problem.
This is the
If you're used to the British system where a minister, and we only ever see on television Prime Minister's question time because that's quite entertaining, but every day in the House of Commons, a minister stands up in the House of Commons and is held accountable for the policy of his department or her department, and if there is a need to change it, it gets changed. There is no similar accountability within the upper governance of the European Union, and that is a problem if you're brought up in the British system. And I remember that when he was Prime Minister, David Cameron said that one weekend he'd had Angela Merkel to Chequers, and she was surprised that as Prime Minister he still had to deal with constituency correspondence, because she would think that he was the Prime Minister, therefore he could find somebody else to do it. And of course this is a misunderstanding of this great British tradition of democracy, and you can put aside modern cynicism, and that's part of the reason we've had this problem with the result of the Brexit referendum, because the government of the day said we will respect the result of the referendum. And this is why we have this conflict now, because nobody expected, or few Guy probably did expect, but not as many people expected that Leave would win. So you have the vast majority of members of the House.
I didn't expect it.
No, well, not most did.
Did you expect it? Did you expect
It was impossible to call.
When was it? 2 years ago?
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Yes.
See, you see how time
Exact
is
point.
Because on my
3
way to the
years
studio, I
on.
was thinking, was it 2 or 3? Because I hadn't looked that up.
But you see, you have all these daft arguments.
3 years.
That the referendum
Since
is
the
not
vote.
legally binding, therefore we can ignore it. But the point is,
Yeah.
the government of the day said we will respect the result of the referendum, and such
Right.
is the feeling for democracy in our country that, although many MPs are probably in favour of remaining, they all feel deep down they cannot ignore the will of the people as expressed in that referendum.
Yep.
And this is why we've had 3 years of nobody knowing what to do next.
Well,
I mean,
actually, let me put
yeah.
you straight on a point
Yeah,
there.
jump in there.
The MPs have felt absolutely they can ignore the result of the referendum,
Yeah.
and that's exactly what they have conspired to do. They have thwarted Brexit so far, and hence we are seeing the potential of huge eruptions beginning already. And so the last time we spoke about this, Will, was in January this year. That was 1 week after the so-called meaningful vote won, when Theresa May brought back the Orwellian misnomer of the withdrawal agreement before
Yeah.
Parliament. An Orwellian misnomer because actually what it did was it was a new treaty, which are very strong and hard to get out of. You ask Spain about Gibraltar and treaties. There's no way they can get back Gibraltar in any legal, peaceful way whatsoever. And under that meaningful vote, this was a treaty to essentially lock Britain into the European Union. It was not a withdrawal agreement. To have all the worst parts of being in the European Union in terms of shoveling cash into it, And as we said, Britain is the second largest net contributor after Germany. And
it's worth making that point again. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's a net contribution to the tune of, give or take, 10 billion euros a year at the moment. Of
First being
British
Germany.
taxpayer money.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that vote, this was the key core piece of government legislation brought forward by the Prime Minister and her cabinet. And that was shot down by the largest majority on a non-trivial matter in parliamentary history. 230 votes margin lost. Under any normal
You'd have
circumstances...
lost the government over that.
Under any normal circumstances, and if Theresa May had had any dignity, she would have resigned after that. That is absolutely the normal, unwritten constitutional arrangement in Britain. But she didn't. She doggedly ignored all the criticism, and she thought that she would wear everybody down, and she brought
So at what point in the timeline do you think she should have resigned?
Well, at that
in
point,
the timeline.
Absolutely at that point.
But what
in
is
the middle
that?
of January.
In the middle of January.
Yes.
At that point.
Yes.
When we were talking.
It's unprecedented. As
I just
Guy,
wanted to try to get a timeline.
But it is
'cause it's a bit
unprecedented,
confusing.
as Guy said, for a government
Yeah.
to lose by such a huge... Well, actually, to lose on a major piece of legislation normally means the government feels it can no longer continue.
Yes.
But she not only did that, she then repeated this on 2 other occasions and still hung on,
Yes.
which is not the way to proceed. I mean, the whole handling, whether you're for leaving the European Union or for remaining, the whole handling of the process post the referendum was faulty.
Yeah.
What we should have had is they should have said, right, we're leaving. Should have had these debates in Parliament about what form the leaving takes, then made a sensible plan, then with that plan in mind served the Article 50 notice and said, this is our plan, this is what we want. We either get this plan or we leave anyway. But then everybody knows where you stand.
Right.
And it was a mistake to accept the European Union negotiating position that first you negotiate the withdrawal agreement, then we talk about everything else. Because how can you talk about everything? How can you have a withdrawal agreement if you don't know what's going to happen afterwards? And if you read Article 50, it doesn't have this two-point
Absolutely. And that's been pointed out.
And
by,
this was the weakness of the British negotiating position from the very beginning. Theresa May, or those advising her, or collectively, should have refused to fall into this EU trap.
Okay. But I think there was a point that was raised before by Guy.
Well, just go back to why the meaningful vote withdrawal agreement misnomer, which essentially was a Remain treaty, failed. It didn't please the Remainers because it was manifestly way worse than staying in the European Union under the current membership conditions. So the Remainers hated it. And of course, as far as if you're a leaver, there was no way this represented leaving the European Union whatsoever, because this withdrawal agreement, essentially, first of all, it said, we're going to stay in the European Union for at least another 2 years from signing it in, which in turn was nearly 3 years after the vote to leave. So the leavers would have to wait at least 5 years. Secondly, it only let Britain leave on the say-so of the Brussels bureaucrats, and with a timeline going on to the end of the century. So, in other words, it was an absolute trap to keep Britain in as just a payee.
Yes, it was
complete and utter
nonsense. It was actually
nonsense.
worse than that. It was actually giving you, you would pay a larger subscription on worse terms
and have no say
in either making the laws or indeed leaving. I mean, even if whether you were a Remainer or a leaver, you had to be against the withdrawal agreement.
But doesn't a lot of the confusion start, accepting this, your point, last 2 points and how they tie in together, accepting that's a technical argument. But let's get back to the principle, perhaps, behind all this. Isn't part of the reason for the conflict, the large conflict, that you have a vote by the people of the country. And, I mean, we can say that England was close, Scotland was very much for remaining, Wales, I don't know, Northern Ireland, I believe, was very much for going away. Then you look at the Parliament. I mean, that's a pretty close. It was a relatively close vote. It was several percent in favour of leaving. What was the exact count? Guy, you know what it was, don't you? I've forgotten.
17.4 million people voted to leave.
Yes.
Which was more than 1.3 million margin over those that voted to remain.
Which is a substantial.
Substantial. 52-48, which people try and pose as a very, very knife-edge result.
That's
but
not
then,
a
just to recap,
then
there was a subsequent general election called by Theresa May under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, she had to get a 2/3 majority in Parliament in order to call a general election. Labour were on the rise, so they thought they'd go for it. And then that election, which was 2 years ago, in June 2017, the Conservative Party manifesto said explicitly, in print, we will implement the result of the EU referendum.
Right.
And with that, we will leave the single market. We will leave the customs union. We will leave the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. There's no further discussion to be had about that. And Labour had similar promises in their manifesto, and collectively, those two main parties achieved 86% of the vote in that general election. So it's a double mandate.
All of these
to leave.
numbers are worth talking about. But
so then you've got, but ever since the 25th of June 2016, 24th of June 2016, when we all woke up to the result
coming up
of
on the
Leave
3-year
winning,
anniversary,
you had. I flew to Britain that day, and it was great fun writing fun portmanteau of other versions of Brexit.
Right.
You know, there's obviously Frexit and so on, but there's more fun ones than that, such as Checkout and Bulgar Off was my favourite I composed.
Bulgar
Off.
Bulgar Off? For the Bulgarians? They're not even in.
Did Portugal, I thought.
I think the Bulgarians want to be in there.
They are.
No, but
they do as long as they're on the net beneficiary.
Were you finished with that thought? Because I wanted to...
Well, no, ever since that moment, the morning of the 24th of June 2016, you had all the sort of metropolitan so-called elite, and in that media, Whitehall civil servants, running around in a fury. Apparently the atmosphere was just explosive. Everyone was furious. It was such a shock to the system that they were literally, you know, spitting teeth. And ever since that moment...
Nice British expression.
Ever since that moment, they've been conspiring to reverse this result. You've had the whole Whitehall machinery.
That was my next point, and thank you for getting to it.
Pushing,
is that
and then you combine that with...
The political machinery is divided from the populace.
And then you combine that with extremely weak leadership.
Right.
With the Conservative Party making a terrible mistake to install a Prime Minister who voted Remain but said she'd go along with the democratic result. That turned out not to be true. She talked the talk all the way up to her Chequers agreement in June last year, June 2018, July, at which point the mask slipped and it became quite apparent that she'd been completely bamboozled by the Whitehall senior civil servants.
OK, so will of the people...
She'd been absolutely talked into having a Brexit in name only deal, which of course the British people have seen through.
Yeah, in other words, we still do business as usual, we just pretend to be out, right?
And from that moment, it's been essentially pitching the people versus Parliament.
Because it would still be too much control.
Exactly, and the current cadre of MPs, most of them, not all of them, there's a few good, proper Democrats in there, but they are outnumbered by about 5 or 6 to 1.
Right.
Most of these MPs have forgotten what being an MP is, which is they are there at the beck and call of the people. They are servants to the people, and they should be servants to democracy, and they've forgotten that.
Well, technically they're representatives,
not
delegates.
You just dovetailed nicely into the point I wanted to make, that I wanted you to make, not me make, but I wanted you to make, which is about the division between the political power and the political will and the will of the people, quite divided. But it's not so surprising, because strong central government either would be very combative with another strong central government, or want to ally with it, depending on where its fortunes are held. Yes, Nicholas, you were going to... words of wisdom, I'm sure.
I think they were getting... Yes, I mean, I think one of the difficulties in all of this is that it was... Because the government of the day was not expecting this result, they hadn't planned for it properly. So when the result came, there was panic, and then there's been this complete sort of paralysis ever since. That's part of the problem. David Cameron's government didn't plan.
He was really surprised.
He was surprised. He didn't plan for it properly. I mean, both sides, I think, ran a not brilliant campaign during the referendum. And the government side led a particularly poor campaign. And I think people underestimate, probably outside the United Kingdom, how negative it was to see George Osborne, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's Finance Minister, lining up with Christine Lagarde of the IMF, telling the British people what to do, followed by Barack Obama putting his foot in it. I mean, that just played negatively.
Followed by Jean-Claude Juncker promising death and pestilence to the United Kingdom if they dared have the temerity to vote to leave the EU.
Exactly.
It was a wonderful gift to the Leave campaign, of course.
It was.
Yeah.
But, and also incredibly foolish of the Remain campaign led by David Cameron and George Osborne, the then Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, standing up there promising a horrible recession, with that a collapse in house prices, a collapse in the stock market, an enormous rise in unemployment. They promised that unemployment was going to go up by another 800,000 people. And the economy would collapse, and all of this would have to be an emergency budget, rise in interest, you name it. They absolutely threw the kitchen sink at it. And of course, the absolute opposite happened.
Well,
And certain journalists were running a sort of Pinocchio fact-checker list. And the Pinocchio index, went off the scale. It was sort of 11 out of 10 on the Pinocchio index, because everything they predicted, the opposite happened. The British economy has got its highest employment
That's also
on
known
record.
as the liar pants on fire
Something like
index.
that. Exactly.
Isn't it?
I mean, by the way, you can point out, of course, that the UK's GDP growth has gone from one of the highest in the European Union to one of the lowest in the same period since the referendum. So it's by no means, and we haven't left yet. That's the other
Well, he's
point.
a stickler. I mean, I'll just speak directly to him and not say he, since he's right in front of me. Guy is a stickler. Guy thinks you've been for this getting out for the whole time. Nicholas, you've had a more
I think it's a genuinely difficult. We don't actually really know. I mean,
serpentine view.
It's not quite serpentine view. It's because I think I'm actually, if I'm honest, I mean, instinctively, for the reasons we spoke about earlier, I'm for our not being part of it. But you have to, in life, take a pragmatic view. You have to start from where you are. And I do wonder, if you look at trade everywhere in the world, you tend to have most of your trade with the countries nearest to you for obvious reasons. And if we want to, I just feel that I'm not sure that we are going to see the sunlit uplands everybody's been promised. Actually,
I don't think we're going to see those anyway.
Because
there's too many people in the world chasing too few goods. But
exactly,
that's another subject.
But just because the balloon hasn't gone pop doesn't mean the tyre isn't very slowly losing air.
But that doesn't mean that you have to let 1 billion people into England till the island sinks. You know?
Well, I'm not saying we should.
Because I think the main issue, the real issue that triggered this was the immigration.
Well, then you raise an interesting point.
I disagree, actually.
Okay, well, let's disagree on that. But I think it had a lot to do with it.
For certain voters, maybe.
Yeah.
But again, and to revise this, it actually doesn't matter anymore why people voted. And for the Remain side to construct and concoct up arguments to suggest that they think that a lot of Remain people voted for such and such a reason, and that doesn't matter, therefore I'm going to ignore your vote, is fundamentally undemocratic.
Example of that, for example?
So,
with the one I'm talking about, immigration?
Ever since June the 24th, 2016, the Remain, first of all, George Osborne stood up and he said, oh, people voted for Brexit. They didn't vote for a hard Brexit. What we need is a soft Brexit. Okay? In the entire referendum campaign, there was no mention of hard or soft Brexit. These were adopted by the Remain side as code words for soft Brexit meaning staying in and ignoring the result, and hard Brexit enacting the referendum and leaving the European Union. And it's been, then this is a relentless campaign by the Remains to sort of get this into the common vocabulary.
Okay.
As if wanting Brexit now, you're being portrayed as being an extremist. Just as in politics now across a lot of the Western world, the liberal lefty side of the argument, they portray you, if you take a central view of having modest taxes, a welfare state that supports the least well-off people in life, and relatively modest spending plans, you're portrayed as extreme hard right.
No, this is classic mixed economy.
And so the whole debate and the whole language of politics in the last 20 years has been going down this Orwellian path. Nowadays, people no longer talk about taxpayer-funded, as it should be, when the government spends your money, which you pay in taxes.
Exactly.
It's all government spending.
Spending your money.
You've even got the Conservative government under Theresa May at the last general election 2 years ago, competing with Labour as to who could spend more money. And no one's making the argument about, well, is that really a good thing to have so much involvement in the economy from the government, with the tax burden going up and up and up? The wealthiest people in Britain today pay a higher proportion of tax than they ever have done in the history of taxation in Britain, you know? So anyway, just coming...
Even more than the 60s. Because in the United States, the 60s, the tax burden was much higher.
Those are the
on the top end.
Those are the
but when the people talk about 90% tax,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean on everything. That's
Yes.
what people forget.
Yes.
It's only at that top level when you're over $10 million a year or something like that. You know?
Sure.
Yeah. But...
so just coming
yeah,
back,
yeah.
you've had this constant, relentless campaign by the Remain side to say and try and portray this picture that, well, the people who voted to leave are a bit stupid. They overwhelmingly didn't go to university and left school at 16. By the way, there's no facts to prove this.
No.
It's all complete hearsay. They're all racist because they don't like immigration. Therefore, they're racist. And therefore their voters...
Well, no, wait a second. Not liking immigration doesn't make you a racist.
No, it doesn't.
I don't think
Of course
that,
not.
But I think-
that the
but I think-
Saudis would
but I
allow a
think-
million people from Eton, Oxford and Cambridge, nice as they are, as we conceive by the present
but
company,
it's very
to
exclusive.
go and live there.
It's very exclusive. There
No,
aren't a million of
I don't
us.
think
Yeah,
Nigerians
yeah.
liked it very much, or Africans liked it very
But Guy
much when there
makes
was
a good
too much
point.
colonialism.
You see, Guy makes...
So
but I think
this is human.
So all this whole discussion...
This is human.
Part of the campaign to
Yeah.
overturn the result
Yeah.
started about 6-7 months ago when the Remain campaign said, let's have a people's vote. By implication, those that voted before weren't real people. They were sort of feral beasts in the north of England that voted to leave the European Union.
What does feral mean?
Wild.
If you'd been to
I
Oxford...
didn't know I'd have to bring a dictionary for this.
Well, no, but if you'd been to Oxford or
I need to-
Cambridge, you'd have known that.
Great Scott.
No, but Guy
It's
makes...
not even a big word. and I
Guy
don't
makes a
know
good
it.
point. Even the Remain camp, if you like, have spoilt their own argument by let's assume that the Remain camp would like a second referendum. But the reality is, if you have a second referendum, there's no guarantee you'll get a different result, because the Remain camp have spent all their time saying anybody who voted to leave was educationally subnormal, always old and should have died off, always XY, always race, always XYZ. So they've insulted half of the population of the country. So
Over
even
half.
if yes,
Over half.
so okay, well,
The
48
majority.
Well, we can
Let's
see
not get
by music, tattoos, et cetera, that being young is not all it's cracked up
Yes.
to be
Well, exactly.
anymore.
It's pretty shocking,
You know,
isn't it?
It's pretty shocking.
Yeah.
Okay. So even if you had even if you
Wait,
conceded their
would you
argument,
like to see my sleeve? Not this sleeve.
No, I wouldn't like to
The
see
one
it.
I have that starts behind my shoulder.
I don't understand things
Yeah.
like these
Okay.
tattoo sleeves, actually.
It's,
One of the many
it's not
things I
just a
don't
picture of my mother. It's a picture of my mother and all my grandmothers going back 3 centuries.
Oh, lovely.
Keep that to yourself.
Yes, keep that to yourself. That's
No, I believe in doing things the right, the full.
I don't. They'll cancel your show if you remove your
Really?
jacket.
Really?
I think so. Yeah, so then that's the point now. They've insulted the other side, so even if you granted them their wish of a second referendum, they may not get the result they think they'd like to receive. That's the problem now. And it's become very polarised. And this is and whatever happens next, you still have to try to get the nation back on a more united footing. And,
Well, that has to happen in a number of nations, but the reason this is interesting and the reason we are talking about it now is because it's a microcosm of things that are going on throughout democracies at the moment. And I don't want to say that immigration is, I'd say immigration or changing demography is a big part of it.
I think immigration is a feature
But
of
economic viability, the changing nature of jobs and technology affecting it, the expense of education. There's a number of huge issues that are shared across the United States and Western Europe. And this really, I think that Britain, not so surprisingly, because as much as it's happened in the past, is a kind of a focus of these problems. It's a laboratory to look at, to try and understand this horribly confusing time. Can I get away with saying that?
And it gets a lot worse, and it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, sadly, in Britain. Because, along with all this hogwash about people not knowing what they voted for and attempts to belittle and tell people who voted leave that you're stupid and don't understand, you just need more Europe. Take your Europe. And again, of course, they've always confused the EU and Europe.
Yes.
Yes.
We live in Europe, on the continental Europe, in Poland here. I think we all love Europeans and the European cultures and history and difficult histories among better histories and people and cultures and all of that diversity. What we don't like is the European Union, which is a failed political experiment.
Yes,
which
this is a point.
Fundamentally
Where did it go
anti-democratic.
wrong? Because Britain was never in at the beginning. The beginning was led by the French.
Yes.
But we weren't in the beginning
by
because
de Gaulle.
de Gaulle vetoed our membership at the
He
beginning.
vetoed it, yeah. After all you did for him.
Exactly.
After all you did for de Gaulle
Exactly.
during the war.
Oh, we did a lot for de Gaulle.
Oh, Churchill, you know,
Exactly.
plus
We made a big effort.
stood under the shadow of
Yes.
his nose.
And
Exactly.
look
You know.
at Macron today.
Yeah.
How
Exactly.
grateful he is, and lovely warm words towards
Yeah,
Britain.
you know,
They've never forgiven us for not losing.
You know
the
my
last-
joke about Macron?
No,
You want to hear it? Sure. Macron, you want to hear it?
please.
Yep, you've probably heard it before. Macron is now Micron, and his wife is looking for a younger man.
Okay, moving on.
Now that's funny because never mind.
Yeah.
Well, she's a lot older
Yeah,
than he is.
but,
That's
you know-
let me explain the whole joke. Yeah.
Yes.
I've also got a cat. No, never mind.
Yes. You're looking for
To throw-
pigeons. Yes.
Exactly.
So Edward Heath took Britain in '72
Right.
without a referendum.
That was Heath. Yeah.
That was
Ted Heath.
Ted Heath.
Yeah.
And that was on the promise of we're not joining any political establishment, we're joining a common market, as it was called. And this is going to enable trade and make life better for everybody
It was
by
about
lowering
trade,
tariffs.
and that's
I'm
the
all for
point.
that.
And everybody's in
That's
favour of trade.
The
yes.
point.
Yeah.
It was about trade.
And then they had
Yeah.
a referendum about whether to stay in 1974.
Yes.
And the vote was to stay. I can't remember what the percentage was, about 57 versus
It was
43 or
quite.
something.
It was yes.
It was a
quite
even
clear,
more
quite
subst-
a, quite a
set-
clear
At that
percentage.
decision.
stage, it was perhaps too early to see the effects, and
Well,
it was
there was
still
a trade
very much
agreement.
a
It
trade
wasn't a
agreement.
government
Yeah.
agreement. It wasn't a currency.
Yeah.
Trying for a currency.
Yes,
a
I-
pan-European currency.
But there's a lot
Exactly.
of, you know, there was secret Whitehall papers even then,
Mm-hmm.
where it was quite explicit. We're hoodwinking the British people into a political establishment to gently,
Well, the Treaty
in a
of Rome,
ratchet
the Treaty of
mechanism,
Rome
under
made
the
this-
way the
yeah,
The
European law
purpose
works, the
being,
acquis.
because this plays, again, it's a great, looking at this problem, it also tells you a lot about the trend towards globalism and what the real motivation is behind this.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest, being a big fan of Mr. Huxley, Aldous Huxley, I would suggest the idea behind this is to, even more than Orwell, Orwell, brilliant journalist, but Huxley, for me, the better book about the future. And
I would agree.
really got what we're doing right, even down to the fact that everybody's fed a drug, because that's happening.
Yeah.
The government feeds drugs.
Actually,
and that's
I think
happening.
we're living in
It's
an.
happened.
I think we're actually living in an age which combines Brave New World and 1984.
Right. Well, thanks
We've
for
got
coming
a-
out with it. you
We've
know,
got aspects
naming the
of
books.
We've got aspects of both. Well, not all your viewers may have read them. They may want to go away and read them. now.
No, thanks for doing that. Yeah, I meant that
Yeah.
sincerely.
Yeah.
I wasn't kidding you.
No.
But,
Makes a change.
yeah, but I will later. No, I mean, it was worth saying the names of those books because
Yeah.
they're crucial to understanding. But I think that it's, to me, what Huxley was saying is in fact coming true, which is, and we see it in the globalism and that the individual becoming, the individual being the foundation of the whole Western idea, is under threat. And once the individual's rights are squashed, the Western idea collapses.
Of course it does.
And we become fodder for corporations and government institutions
Well, this is
who
the-
want to crush us.
Well, that is the problem. We are increasingly becoming fodder. I mean,
Yeah.
as traditional boundaries are dissolved, that may be family boundaries, that may be trade union boundaries, that may be geographical boundaries, then you're left more and more, religious boundaries, you're left more and more on your own. Of course, on your own, you are easily dealt with by a large corporation
Correct,
or by
and
government.
take away the family as well.
Exactly. If
Yeah.
you are part of a unit, be it your family, be it your village, your town, your city, your church or whatever, you're
Local ties.
You're much harder to influence, which is, of course, why you'll have these large corporations rather cynically, in my view. And we saw it at the weekend here.
Well, we know it's cynical.
In
They've
Warsaw.
said it.
You saw at the weekend in this gay pride march in Warsaw, for example.
Yeah.
You'll have seen the T-shirts with all
Well,
the
I read about it. I
well, yeah,
wasn't
but
in
with
town.
well, I wasn't in town either.
Yeah.
But with all the large corporations with their little rainbow logos. I mean, this is completely cynical behaviour.
Well, this is another subject. I don't want to.
No,
we
sure.
could talk about that subject on another show, and the gender wars, etc.,
Well,
which is
exactly.
fascinating.
But I mean, it's all going to your
Yeah.
point about dissolving cultural
Yeah,
boundaries.
dissolving. You said it best. You said, if I may repeat what you said, to emphasize
With pleasure,
it.
often as well.
Okay, I've got a T-shirt. I'll have T-shirts made for us and
Yes.
for all our friends.
Thank you.
That it's breaking down the individual, separating him from things that will give him an identity that is not related to a huge, faceless, mindless, grinding institution.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of this is part of, it's the threatening of what you know rather than cooperation with what you know. And immigration does that, but the corporations do it too. It's two different ways of doing the same thing. And it goes back to well, you're too excited, but it goes back to what I always say, and I don't know if you'll agree, but I think there's just too many people in the world. We're not used to this huge population chasing too few goods to be able to live in the way that they see on television.
Yes.
It's not going to happen for everybody. It's not possible.
Well, I mean,
Actually, no, I very respectfully
you would disagree with that.
Because what you're essentially
yeah.
talking about is a sort of Malthusian pessimism.
I knew we were going to get to Malthus.
Where
Well,
Malthus
no, it's not that,
predicted
though.
that,
It's just practicality.
that eventually we're all going to be impoverished because too many people chasing too few resources. However,
But wait, that's not what I'm
actually,
saying.
we've
I'm
got-
very familiar
there's
with
plenty
Mr.
of
Malthus,
resources,
and he's been
yeah,
disproved.
absolutely.
His theory's been disproved.
yes,
It's not
and
that.
And globally, the average wealth has never been higher.
That's fine.
So that's a wonderful
and
thing.
it is.
And-
but
and-
everybody
and
can't come and
millions
live
and-
in Western Europe.
Millions, and,
No,
but,
they
and
can't.
globally,
That's the point.
millions of people through international trade
Guy.
with lower trade barriers have
Yeah.
been drawn out of poverty and are getting
is
better
certainly
paid
true.
jobs.
Guy, the
and
Indians.
have a much better future rather than living on less than $1 a day.
I'd like to see them uplifted, but where they are. Because the Chinese and the Indians could easily send a couple 100 million, never miss them, and overpopulate both the United States and Europe within a generation or two. And that will happen. And that is not good if you believe in the history of your own country. I mean, if you think imperialism was an invasion, look at this. It's another kind of imperialism. And I'm not saying it's even, I'm not saying that it's some kind of conspiracy. I say it's just demographics and a natural drift toward where life is more interesting and better.
Of course.
Well, I think there needs to be a grown-up discussion about this because
Yeah.
you do get people
all I'm
who are,
saying.
you know, who follow identity politics and they just say, oh, if you are against any immigration, you're wrong, and they think that's all there is to be said about
Hey, well,
it.
some of my best friends are.
You know, and again,
as people say.
but you know,
I'm gonna
personally,
make that
I
mistake.
believe in free
Yeah.
markets, and in that, free movement of capital, free movement of goods, and
Yeah.
free movement of labour.
Yes,
And-
but to a point.
But free movement of labour
Yeah.
means people who contribute, who want to have a job and not be economic migrants. And right now, I think one of the issues for many people in Britain is economic migrants
Yeah.
taking advantage of Britain's very generous welfare state.
You mean people coming in and assimilating into
Yes,
society,
yes.
as the old
Yeah.
American tradition
Yeah.
and British tradition used
Exactly.
to be particularly,
Yeah.
and as the Turks did in Germany, they became
Yeah.
part of the society. They speak the language. Not the
Sure.
Turkish people in Germany may speak Turkish at home, and the older. But they wanted to learn German and become part of the German society.
Sure. But
Just
on this
as-
point, though, again, it's a very controversial point,
Yeah.
and partly because the
Well,
data,
just as
the
we've
data
done
is
being in
mixed.
Poland.
There are certain
We've learned
studies,
Polish and those things.
but talking
the
about
customs
whether
and-
migration into Britain, whether it's been so-called economic migrants or people who are there to work, there are mixed reports. Some reports say very confidently, with various statistics, that the net contribution is very positive towards the economy. But then other people argue, say, well, actually, you haven't factored into a whole bunch of costs they bring in terms of strain on infrastructure, hospitals, places in schools. and
Initial
so on.
expenditure to get them in.
House prices,
before they
pricing
start producing.
pricing everybody out of the housing
I think
market,
I
and so
think-
on. So it's a very complex picture.
It's very
The
complex.
problem is this.
And over generations, it does
Yes,
tend to pay.
but the problem
pay
is
off,
we
especially
face-
if you need labour.
I think the problem we face now is the scale of immigration. There was a very good book written by a chap who writes for the Financial Times called Reflections on the Revolution, a chap called Christopher Caldwell. And he was writing a book about, and it's quite a frightening book in the sense it's written very objectively, very rationally, very calmly, about immigration into Europe. And he asks the question, ultimately, is Europe Europe if it's no longer populated by Europeans? And when he makes the point in the book, looking at the statistics, that the size of immigration into Europe has been relatively so large, it's been much larger than the scale of immigration into the United States when the United States was a young country crying out for immigrants. And this is the problem. It's the speed and scale which I think has upset a lot of people. It's made them feel very uncomfortable.
Because there's no time to assimilate. It's just waves.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there are a lot more people who want to come and live in Europe than there are Europeans who want to go live there for obvious reasons.
Exactly. Exactly.
But not that it's not wonderful to go and be in India for a time or be in Africa for a time. They're fascinating places, and everybody knows that who's been there. But going and living there, you do expect, or certainly in the Middle East, if you've ever lived and worked in the Middle East, I happen to have. I know you've traveled there a lot. I don't know about Nicholas so much.
I've not been to the Middle East.
Okay.
Africa, yes, not the Middle East.
Africa, yes, that's right. No, I remember you have. Yeah. But the point being that when one goes there, you expect to conform pretty strictly.
Of course.
Because you just won't be tolerated not
Sure.
to. And I'm not saying that we should be the same, but being more open, then that has to, the least you ask for is assimilation.
But I think in America, in the early days of America, everybody assimilated. You could be Italian at home or you could be Greek
everybody
at home.
wanted to.
But in the public sphere, you were proud to be American because
Everybody
was American.
Right, because
and it didn't matter where you were from, you were still American, and nobody looked on you as being less of an American.
Absolutely true. I remember that from school myself.
Exactly. So, but at home
you didn't think about it.
At home you could be Spanish or Italian or whatever it was,
didn't think
Irish, so
about
that was
it,
fine.
really. Yeah.
But in the public sphere in America, you were proud to be an American because you were the same as every other American.
Absolutely.
And this is what is being undermined.
In a position of privilege in the world to be an American, to be able to be there and enjoy that freedom, and to reinvent yourself.
And this is what's happening. We're not allowing, or we're undermining folks' ability to assimilate, and this is part of the problem as well. We're saying, oh, well, this identity politics. Let's ghettoise. Oh, well, you're a West Indian, therefore you're going to be treated a different way from you're a Muslim. And instead of saying, well, actually, you're in Great Britain, we have, or in America, we have what we think are our general cultural values, and everybody's welcome who conforms to those cultural values. If you want to go to the mosque at the weekend, fine, but in the public sphere, you're not going to turn up to your employer and say, by the way, I need a prayer room because I'm a Muslim.
Correct.
And this is what's happening.
This would be insulting to the traditions of where we were, and actually to the other people. Because nowadays, this victim grievance culture
that's exactly
says,
the point.
hey, look at me. I'm more important, my special needs. No, wrong.
No, sure.
The needs of the community.
And I think
that leads to chaos, and that's a lot of what's
and the
behind
politicians
the problems.
in Western Europe have been very weak in defending those cultural values.
Yeah.
Saying, okay, you're very welcome, you make a contribution, but in the public sphere in our country, there are certain things you do. For example, you don't, and with the French have taken the view, you don't wander around the streets with a veil so we can only see your eyes, because we don't think that is a particularly comfortable thing. We don't allow you, if we, for example, decide that it's cruel to kill animals other than in a modern abattoir with modern sort of processes which try to make the animals' last moments as quick and as painless as possible, we're not going to then have halal killing just because that's your religion.
Which is cutting the animal, hanging it up in the blood drain.
Because, to be fair, Europe is based on Christian values, and in Christian values you can be a Christian or not a Christian, but you as a Christian or I as a Catholic or whatever, I don't impose my values on everybody else. I'm not required to kill animals in a funny way or do other funny things. It's essentially between me and God and whatever. Whereas the Muslims say no, but we have to have this. I can give you. It's a silly example. I can give you one example. When my sister.
Not all Muslims do.
No.
Because I went to school. Let me just finish.
Yeah,
I went to school with some Muslims, with Indians, people like that. You went to school with them as well.
Yes.
We all have grown up that way, and people didn't make special pleading.
But this is the point.
They didn't want it.
They wanted to get on and join in.
Yes, and on the weekend or whenever, you would have to go.
Well, that's the point.
Not have to go, but you would enjoy.
But now they're
traditions.
encouraged.
You would do it.
But now the governments in Western Europe like to stoke up the grievances. They say, well, you don't have to assimilate, or whatever. And then, of course, you then have these other problems. So the governments don't help.
We got to this from Brexit, and
yes,
there was a
but
reason.
Brexit
Let's try to get back to that.
But Brexit is about identity as well.
But this is the kind of discussions that one has these days, looking at this subject, because why is everybody arguing about Brexit? Because of these issues.
But because
they're not being addressed.
Because Brexit is about what an Englishman, Britain, but even before Great Britain was invented, England, an Englishman, those that had the vote, voted for a member of Parliament who represented him in Parliament and to whom he was accountable. And if something wasn't right, he could do something about it, which is why you will see in British general elections, something you never see in Europe where they have proportional representation systems, senior politicians in the United Kingdom lose their seats. For example, at the last election, the one before that, sorry, the 250.
Happens in the United States too.
You
I can tell you.
Nick Clegg, Deputy Prime Minister, leader of the party,
Right.
lost his seat
Right.
because enough people get through.
Yeah.
You can't. In Poland, for example,
And
who actually is in government is the party. The party decides where you sit on the list.
Well, it's
And therefore-
proportional.
Yeah, but essentially, if you're high up in the party, then you're going to be elected because that's the way the system works.
You're going to get,
there
you're
is a-
guaranteed
there
a
is
seat.
not-
There's a-
And
puts
what you're
another
saying is
layer
power
between-
can always fall, and in the United States is the same. And it's not to criticize the system here.
No, but you need
but
that. We are used from the Anglo-Saxon system to have a
That's the
direct,
point
a
you're
direct
making.
link between my
Right.
vote
And
and
power.
that person in power.
And if we don't like that person,
Because
even
we
if
can- I
whoever
can-
it is, we can get rid of him. But remember, there's also a big difference between the United States and Great Britain. We know this, of course, but a point worth making, and that our president is elected separately.
Yes.
In the UK, the Prime Minister to be chosen by the party and voted on.
Yes,
by the
exactly.
party.
But the Prime Minister is still personally accountable to his or her electorate.
That's
in their
right,
constituency.
through the representatives.
Exactly.
And I think another
And
fundamental...
they can always have a vote of no confidence.
And I think the Brexit was very much about, all of a sudden, people felt, hang on a minute, decisions are being made about our country in Brussels, and we cannot, they may or may not be good decisions, but we cannot have this direct link. If we don't like Mr. Juncker, we can't vote him out. In fact, I don't think anybody in the European Union can actually vote him out, or any of these characters. And that, for somebody brought up in the British parliamentary system, has always been a problem for the last 40-odd years.
Excellent, Nicholas. We're running out of time now. We're running to time. I could talk about with you fellas for for hours, and we've done it before privately. But let's put in a nutshell, Guy, if you'd sum up your argument in a nutshell for why Britain should leave, and if you could sum up why it might be better for Britain to fight within the EU.
Okay.
Which is also something you have said to me,
of course,
and to Guy. Guy, first.
It's fundamentally a question of democracy and who makes British laws for Britons. And that question was put to the people 3 years ago. There was a clear vote to leave. There was a subsequent general election at which that mandate to implement the result of the referendum and leave was very clearly voted for, but 86% of people in the country voted for parties that said in their manifestos, we're going to leave the European Union, and with that the customs union, and the single market, and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. And now, we then had the Prime Minister, Theresa May, stand up no less than 108 times on the record and say, we are leaving the European Union on the 29th of March, 2019. That was broken promise. She then went back to the European Union and has twice extended. So not only has she failed to deliver on the promise, she has now perhaps caused an existential threat to the existence of the Conservative Party, and what is worse, give almost an odds-on chance perhaps for having a Marxist-led government get into number 10 Downing Street. And so Britain now has to leave. Otherwise, Britain has fundamentally not become, has lost its democracy. There's a temporary hiatus in democracy in Britain, you could say, at the moment. So it's a very, very serious situation. And unless the new Prime Minister right now, we have the hustings for the new Conservative Party leader, and unless they absolutely do leave by the 31st of October now, if that does not happen, then I think you're going to perhaps see civil unrest in Britain start. And, you know, all these yellow vest riots you've seen in Paris for the last 4 or 5 months, that's going to kick off in Britain.
Well, I remember the poll tax riots, and they were not for penny waste. Those were serious back in the early 90s.
How disgraceful is it that Britons have been sent back to the polls a few weeks ago for the European parliamentary elections, nearly 3 years after the result of the referendum, over 2 years after implementing Article 50, part of the Lisbon Treaty, which explains how you leave the European Union, and that's supposed to be a one-way street, 2 years, leave. Britons had to vote for membership of the European Parliament again. And it's worth making the point, even though we're short of time, that a party which was only founded 6 weeks before that vote, called the Brexit Party, with the clear mandate to say, you know, you've been lied to by the Conservative Party, you've been lied to by the Labour Party, and all the other coalitions in Parliament have been thwarting Brexit. if you vote for us, we are going to implement the mandate to leave. They, from nothing, achieved 32% of the vote.
That's astounding, and that is a point well worth
making. And sent the
making.
Conservative Party into a sort of distant third or fourth position.
Yeah. So that would support, I mean, that's a very good example of supporting your argument, and thank you, Guy. Nicholas, would you care to improve upon that or challenge that?
I don't challenge what Guy says about the democratic mandate at the time. I think you have to be on these occasions very pragmatic. Unfortunately, the decision or the failure of a proper negotiation meant that 3 years on we're still in this mess. And then you have to try to work out what is in the best interest of the country. Now, you said, is there an argument for saying we stay and make a better job of it? And I think the argument is this. I think the United Kingdom has never been properly engaged. And if you take, for example, some of the things that, I believe that if we properly engage, we will be running the European Union in 5 to 10 years' time. And it wouldn't be a question of us somehow having lost our sovereignty, which I don't think we ever really lost in any meaningful sense. But we would be us having acquired sovereignty over the other 28 member states. And I put as exhibit number 1 that great Thatcherite invention. Essentially, it was a Thatcherite invention, the single market. And Mrs. Thatcher was quite clear. Wouldn't it be wonderful for British business to have a market on its doorstep with no borders, no restrictions on us selling goods to whoever we wanted? And I think that argument still stands. That is a great Thatcherite invention. And I just feel that there's something. I accept the democratic point. And this is part of the problem. How do you reconcile the two things? But I think we have a genuine conflict between the democratic will as expressed in the 2016 referendum, the events in the world over the last 3 years, and the feeling amongst many people that somehow, how do we reconcile that with what is in actually the best interests of our country? Because as Guy said, if we have civil disturbance, I doubt we would have civil disturbance because we've not really had that very often in our history.
You did with the poll tax, and it was very serious.
But that was yes.
Oh, that was a mess.
I know it was a mess. but the people who are arguing now for, we've got to have Brexit, otherwise we're going to take it on the streets and riot. Well, I suspect that the people will be equally disappointed if we find in 3 or 4 years' time that it's all been a deadly mistake and the Japanese have closed their car factories and Ford have closed their car factories. Nobody else has closed
Ford just announced last week that there's no problem whatsoever with their just-in-time delivery.
Yes, but they also announced last week.
If Britain was to leave tomorrow,
we're going to have to come back for part 2.
No. But Ford also
trotting out.
No, but Ford announced last week they were
going to. His rebuttal.
But actually,
well done.
It isn't a problem.
It
isn't a problem for Ford because Ford announced last week they were closing an engine plant in the UK.
Yes, but the global car manufacturing industry has got bigger problems than Brexit.
Well, I know, but Brexit allows it to as an excuse to close the factories in the UK and not elsewhere.
But that's a good place. The controversy over Brexit still goes on. Very good points made by Guy, I think you'll agree, and by Nicholas. And although we didn't stay completely on the subject of Brexit, I think that we gave a good history of the recent and past ideas of why the British went into the common market eventually, which became the European Union, and perhaps we've been reasonably cogent in talking about why the British want to get out, according to the voters anyway. Thanks for watching this edition of There's a Will. And there certainly is a will. That's me. And this is Guy Pinsen and the estimable Nicholas Richardson. We've just had a little Oxbridge debate over Brexit. And I'm glad to say no fisticuffs were involved.
No.
Which is very nice.
Queensberry rules one day. Thank you, Will.
Okay,
thanks
you, Will.
for watching, and thanks for coming in. Yeah.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Will. Pleasure.
Okay, thank you. Bye.